Jumping into Chapter 4, we're going to talk about the legal and professional issues in prescribing. These are our objectives. Federal law overview. I find this very fascinating when we talk about the history of the FDA, how they learned how to do drug approval, how they labeled, all of these things, and how they came into being. So the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was first done in 1906, but it did not prevent the manufacturing of unsafe or ineffective medications. The change to that in 1938 restricted drug adulteration, misbranding, and interstate commerce of unapproved drugs. The Harris-Kefauver Amendment of 1962 mandated the safety and efficacy of drugs prior to marketing. The Orphan Drug Act of 1983 improved drug availability for rare diseases. Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984 expanded the number of generic drugs suitable for an abbreviated new drug application. The Pediatric Research Equity Act of 2003 required pediatric studies of safety and efficacy. And then the Drug Quality, Safety, and Security Act of 2013 enhanced security provisions within the drug supply chain and increased the ability of trace drug distribution and recall in the event of a harmful product reaching the market. Obviously, very important. So when you talk about the U.S. Food and Drug Administration regulatory jurisdiction, what do they do? How do they work? So on and so forth. So the FDA regulates drug companies, and it encompasses the standardization of nomenclature. It controls the approval of process for new drugs and new indications for old drugs. It controls the official labeling, surveillance of adverse drug events, and the methods of manufacturing and distribution. Okay. Products labeled with the legend, "Caution, federal law prohibits dispensing without a prescription," are regulated by the FDA and are referred to as legend drugs. The new drug approval process. Preclinical research is the process of synthesis and extraction to identify new molecules with the potential to produce a desired change in the biological system. Pharmaceutical dosage formulation and stability testing make up the process of turning an active compound into a form and strength suitable for human use. We talked about this, that we have investigational phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So to review, phase 1 is the first testing of a new compound in subjects for the purpose of establishing the tolerance of healthy human subjects at different doses. Phase 2 is controlled studies performed on patients having the disease to determine a compound's potential usefulness and short-term risks. It has a relatively small number of subjects. And then phase 3 are controlled and uncontrolled clinical trials of a drug's safety and efficacy in hospital and outpatient settings in a larger cohort of people. Bioavailability studies use healthy volunteers to document the rate of absorption and excretion of a compound's active ingredient of the body. Companies conduct bioavailability studies at the beginning of the human testing and just before marketing to show that the formulation used to demonstrate safety and efficacy in clinical trials is equivalent to the product that will be distributed for sale. We have regulatory review new drug application. To market a new drug for human use, the manufacturer must submit an NDA for approval by the FDA. All information about the drug gathered during the drug discovery and development process is assembled in this document. And then the FDA has to investigate, and they have 60 days to determine whether the NDA will be filed for review. Usually the FDA requests additional information, so Typically, the manufacturers need 1 to 5 years to complete any additional well-controlled trials necessary to support the claim for the drug's approval. This is a double-edged sword, the length of time that it takes for a drug to reach the general population. It's a great thing because obviously we want really strict, really thorough and complete strategies to ensure safety of the public. However, when a new drug has been determined and you are a person with the disease that maybe is rare or your loved one has it, and you know that this new drug works and it's shown all of these great results, and it's stuck in production and FDA approval, and it won't be on the market for 5 years, and you're sitting here watching yourself or your loved one die of an illness, it can be a very frustrating process. So they decided to create the expedited approval of new drug application, meaning, hey, we don't want to wait for 5 years to get this drug on the market. You also remember that we have to have post-approval research because the detection of rare things often is not found until you distribute the drug to tens of thousands instead of maybe 1,000 or 2,000 patients. And then again, the FDA will monitor that and process that information through MedWatch. Official labeling. The FDA regulates what goes on a label. So we have over-the-counter drugs, and then we have things like package inserts and physician desk references. We also have things that are off-label prescribing. So you can say, this is not an FDA-approved use of this drug, but anecdotally, in practice, we use it this way. So I'm using it off-label. There are some things that are really commonly used off-label, but the FDA doesn't want to spend the time or the money or the research to actually go through the process to approve that new label, so it just remains off-label, which is really annoying, actually, your prescriber, in my opinion. The decision is based on the best interest of the patient, understanding the medication being prescribed, the rationale, the expert medical opinion, what the literature is supporting, and whether or not there's been randomized clinical trials. As a nurse practitioner, you are going to be responsible for knowing the FDA indication and approval status of the drug you're choosing. But again, you have the decision to make on how to use the drug, and it has to be based on what is best for the patient. In some professional liability suits, the FDA-approved drug labeling may have evidentiary weight, but drug labeling is not intended to set the sole standard for what is good clinical practice. So off-label prescribing can also result in harm to the patient, so we have to be careful. NPs must also be aware that Medicare and other insurers rarely cover off-label prescriptions, so that's an issue. You are recommended to be well advised to clearly document any decision-making and consent processes where just prescribing a drug for off-label use. Pediatric off-label prescribing also has kind of its own framework to make sure that we can use the medications the right way for children, because there's challenges of constructing ethical trials for children. And so this BRAVO is the benefit risk assessment of off-label use of children or drugs in these children. All right, the good old-fashioned, happy-go-lucky controlled substance. Oh my gosh, this has also been a railroad. That's not what I wanted to say. A roller coaster. It's also been a roller coaster ride the last couple of years on what is a controlled substance, who can prescribe them. And that is because they're considered to be dangerous drugs that need to be controlled and regulated more closely. So they came up with the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, and it was designed to improve the regulation of the manufacturing, distribution, and dispensing of drugs that were identified as controlled substances, and then gave the rules and standards of how to prescribe them. Every person who manufactures, distributes, prescribes, procures, or dispenses any controlled substance must have a DEA number. All practitioners who regularly dispense and administer controlled substances must maintain and keep on file for a minimum of 2 years accurate records of controlled drugs they purchase, distribute, administer, or dispense. Which is what they're talking about here. Your DEA number is not used for insurance. It's literally the number that you have to prove that you can write for controlled substances. So let's go through the controlled substance schedule. So Schedule 1 Schedule 1 drugs are things like heroin or LSD or peyote or marijuana. There's no accepted medical use, no legal use is permitted, and it's for registered research at facilities only. So you will never prescribe a Schedule 1 controlled substance. Okay, Schedule 2. These are things like our opioids and narcotics. So morphine, opium, hydromorphone, the stimulants, methylphenidate, amphetamines, some of the depressants like phenobarbital. So a Schedule 2 controlled substance cannot have a refill. You can only have written prescriptions and only telephone in true rare emergencies. And electronic prescribing was permitted as of 2011 with specific software and secure identification processes. I was practicing before 2011, and getting someone a pain medication was really difficult because it had to be written and all the things. So I'm so thankful that they updated to electronic prescribing. Schedule 3, these are ones that I always consider opiates that are in combo. So like Norco or Lortab, which is hydrocodone with acetaminophen. Some of the other stimulants are in this, and some of the other depressants are in this. These you can give prescription for refill, and you can do it over the phone. Schedule 4 is the same as Schedule 3, pretty much, and these are just some of the different medications like phentermine, which is the drug or the weight loss one, and then our benzos are on here as well. And then Schedule 5 are the same as all prescription drugs, and they can be dispensed without a prescription unless regulated by the state laws. Okay. Pregabalin is on here. Remember that things like Ambien is I believe, a controlled 3 drug as well. If you are working, especially in outpatient or out of hospital facilities, you could be in a situation where you're actually given a prescription pad of printer paper that you could write on. You have to be responsible for that. Prescription printer paper should be stored in locked areas. We have to have good lockdown so that there's no misuse of the paper that we can write prescriptions on. You should have your name, your NPI, your address, and your telephone, and your DEA number if it's a controlled substance. We should talk about these things as well. So the date written, authorized refills. You should also spell out the quantity of the drug. So instead of just writing the number 2, because maybe someone could turn that into an 8, you should write out dispense 2 TWO tablets or 20 tablets written out. And you can fax or electronically transmit any prescription except for the Schedule 2s. Drugs with, or all of the controlled substances are that way because they also can have high abuse potential. Some of the drugs are that way because they have a problematic adverse effect profile. And some of those are that way because they have a very narrow safety margin. You talk about this quite a bit later on in your decision and management courses, that you should have a thorough and complete pain assessment where you are really making sure that you are paying attention to an accurate diagnosis and assessment with some sort of validated screening tool and legitimate reasons for prescribing things like opioids. In practice, there are lots of opportunities for people to abuse the system. So there are principles for prescribers to help prevent some of these things. So we want to make sure that we have chemical dependent screening skills and education, that we have early and firm parameters regarding indications and why we're doing what we're doing for prescribing, that we have careful documentation of the diagnosis and the reasons of using the drug, and we are encouraged as practitioners and prescribers to practice just saying no and feeling comfortable providing alternatives without escalating the discussion into an argument with the patient. We should be on alert for behavioral red flags. There are certain behaviors that we worry could be signs of someone being diverting the drug or misusing the drug, some of those kind of things. And that is listed out in your book as well. Talked about that. And here's the screen with the red flags. Okay, pressure to prescribe. Overprescribing of antibiotics, polypharmacy, and then opioids could be a result of our pressure to prescribe. And these are very real things. I think that most of us that end up as nurse practitioners or CNSs tend to be a more gentle population of people. We're caregivers, we're empathetic, we're there to help. And so it can be really hard to say no, especially when the patient is pleading, begging, or arguing, or confrontational about it. There have been times in my career that, yes, I've had to stand firm and say, I'm sorry. I understand that you are frustrated, and I wish I could ease your frustration right now. However, there are rules in place, and I will not do X, Y, and Z. I do not prescribe that way. X, Y, Z, I am held to standards, I'm held to rules and regulations, all those things, and I've had to stand firm and stand your ground. And it takes practice. It's not always something that we are comfortable in doing, especially even for things like antibiotics. You know, people took off work, drove across town, checked into the clinic, paid the $35 or $50 copay to see you. They are determined. They know what they need, and they need that antibiotic. And when you say, no, you have a head cold, I'm so sorry, try your nasal rinses, and here's some, decongestant. And they want an antibiotic. They know what they need. The last time the doctor just gave me just gave me that Z-Pack, and I was fine. I want a Z-Pack. And you say, it's not indicated, I'm not going to do that. What's the harm? Just give me the Z-Pack. It can be really uncomfortable. So that is something that will come with time and practice for you. We know that we use our non-pharmacological treatments as part of the symptom management, especially for pain. And that can be really hard to say no to when someone is determined to have pain medicine. Enabling refers to the powerful instinct practitioners have to do anything medically possible to assist patients with present or potential disability. The definition of enabling also encompasses behaviors on the part of the friends and families or the healthcare providers who shelter the chemically dependent individual from the adverse consequences of the disease. A common statement for practitioners who have been manipulated into enabling and overprescribing is, I was only trying to help. If you suspect a patient is misusing medications, you have to effectively communicate and deal with the conflict when you ask them about it. You have to balance empathy with confrontation. This, again, takes practice. Many nurse practitioners feel uncomfortable with conflict, and so oftentimes you have to kind of just practice it and learn it as you go, unfortunately. You do have good communication skills, especially as nurses, and so you will learn this and you will figure it out. I love that the book actually puts this in writing, and if I were you, I would write this down in my clinical notebook or print this off and take it with you to your first job. They say, make the statement, I am feeling pressured by you to write a prescription that is not clinically indicated. Because of this, I am really concerned about you, and we need to talk about your use of X, Y, and Z. But you can also just say, I am feeling pressured by you to write the prescription that you are asking for, but it is not clinically indicated. I would like to try to communicate, I am feeling this way. I understand your frustration. X, Y, and Z. All right. Systemic solutions to problems of controlled substance prescribing. Clear charting and documentation is essential for prescribing any medication, but especially for controlled substances. So in your note, you have to have a physical evaluation of the patient. This shows that you have an established relationship professionally with the patient. And I'm going to kind of go off track here for a second, but this is where the fence post or the neighbor fence post mentality comes into play. We go through a lot of school, a lot of education, a lot of training, and we are found to be able to make rational decisions about prescribing. We have prescriptive authority. So when we're leaning on our fence post and we're chatting with our neighbor whom we know well, we've known them for years. Sometimes your neighbor is, Aunt Betty Sue, and you know her history in and out because she's been telling you about it for years, and she has a little infection on her great toe, and she couldn't get into the doctor today, and she asks you, can't you just write me an antibiotic for it? It is really hard to say no, and people pressure you to do it. When you have friends, families, coworkers, to be able to say no to people doesn't always feel good and can be really hard. However, in a court of law, if something bad happened and you were sued for prescribing a medication, you will have absolutely no leg to stand on in a court of law unless you have a documented physical evaluation of the patient and a documented professional relationship with the patient that you prescribed for. If you do not have those and you prescribe, do not ever blame anybody else if you lose your license or get sued. It is really that black and white. If you want to make prescription or make decisions to prescribe for somebody whom you don't have a record of a professional relationship with or some kind of previous physical evaluation documented on the patient, okay, meaning you have not established a provider-patient relationship that can be proven on paper, and you choose to prescribe, you are outside your scope of practice and you can be sued. It is really that simple. So, you should not prescribe for friends, family, neighbors. Definitely not your own family, in my opinion, and in what you're going to be told from everybody. Okay? Do people do it? Sure, happens all the time. Should we be doing it? Absolutely not. So that's my soapbox. We'll move back on to your careful documentation. You should put the diagnosis and the reason for giving it. You should have clinical indications documented for treatment. You should have a written out treatment plan. You should have the expected outcomes, the informed consent, and the consultation or collaboration necessary that you use to make your decisions. Then every prescription for the controlled substance should include these things along the way. Inclusion of a titration plan is also maybe an important part of your documentation around your prescription. Your book has your prescribing pearls, which I think is great. One of the first things they do is to make sure you collect and document your own history and physical. You do not rely on the patient's history, okay? You need to actually vet the patient and get objective information. It is good to prescribe limited quantities of medications without refills on a first visit, allowing additional time for patient assessment and confirmatory documentation. Okay. It goes through there. I'd like for you guys to read those. I'm not going to read those all out loud to you, but those prescribing pearls can be helpful. Medication agreements is a tool that we use to help define and implement our objectives and have some kind of written tool signed by the patient as well. This is often used in chronic pain and long-term management of opioids. You can use it for anything, though. It doesn't just have to be for pain management. It is advisable to treat medication agreements under a universal precaution model of care, meaning that the NP develops and uses agreements that are expected of all patients requiring ongoing use of medication. It should be equitable and a potential legal liability to pick and choose. It is inequitable and a potential liability to pick and choose which patients are asked then to sign that versus others. So in other words, if you only do it for low-income people, or you only do it for unemployed people, or you only do it for this, and this, that is inequitable and could open you up to a lawsuit. Then we have the prescription drug monitoring programs, the PDMPs. Oftentimes, these can be built into your electronic health record, and it allows you to query a confidential database statewide to evaluate whether a patient has received a prescription elsewhere. Very helpful, and a really good practice is to document that you checked the PDMP. Each of your states that you work in could have their own specific rules. Remember, the federal law determines if a drug requires a prescription, but the states can decide who can prescribe it. Okay, so you have to know what your prescriptive authority is in the state you are practicing. These are pretty simple things, but think about it. You should be using pre-printed prescription pads or electronic templates that contain the right information. Write the complete drug name, write out everything, write the date of the prescription. You're trying to make it tamper-proof. Make sure it's clear, so you use metric units of measure such as milligrams and milliliters. Avoid abbreviations. Avoid as needed. Avoid general things like use for infection. It should say for cellulitis, for pneumonia, for tooth abscess, etc. You can write dispenses written if a generic is okay, if a generic is not desired. You should include things like the weight, if that's a factor in what you dosed. You can write prescriptions for things like medical devices or home health products as well. So oftentimes on a script pad of paper, you can write for a wheelchair, for example, those kind of things. Some states can have regulatory prescribing details as well, so you should always know what your state requires. Almost all now, I would say, electronic health records has an electronic prescribing built into it. It's supposed to help reduce errors and increase accountability in drug tracking. Remember, we have ethical considerations. You should always have informed consent, which means you have established the person's competency or capacity to make and participate in your decisions. This is where we talked about the prescribing for family and friends, that you should not do it. It's not good practice, and you will not have a leg to stand on. And then we have NP roll outside of the United States. I'm not going to focus a lot of time in our discussion today. Let's get to our knowledge check. Which of the following statements most closely reflects a safe prescription? A, which is the drug name, the strength, the dose, and the date. Which of the following are behavioral red flags for identifying patients who may be addicted to controlled medications? The answer here is B, using illicit drugs, forging prescriptions, or selling prescription drugs. All right, guys, we made it through the next chapter. We're cooking with Crisco. These are pretty simple, straightforward chapters, and I'll see you in chapter 5.